All right, anatomy students, welcome to the second video in the series covering the lecture material on the respiratory system. Today we're going to talk about the lower respiratory tract, going from the trachea, the bronchi, and down into the bronchioles, as well as talking about the protective layerings of not only the chest cavity, but the lungs themselves, known as the pleura. And so let's go ahead and get this educational ball rolling. All right, let's go ahead and get started with the second video in the respiratory system video series. And now we're going to move into the lower respiratory tract. So immediately below the larynx, we have the trachea, and it is a semi-rigid pipe made of semicircular cartilaginous rings and located anterior to the esophagus. So semi-rigid, meaning that it stays open. It is rigid enough that it won't collapse under normal change of air pressure. It is made of semicircular cartilaginous rings, meaning that the rings of cartilage aren't complete. They're kind of a crescent moon or a C-shaped. If you think of the capital letter C, that is the shape, and they are the open end of the ring is to the posterior or to the back and located anterior to the esophagus. So your trachea is going to be in front of your esophagus. And the reason the rings of cartilage are open towards the posterior is so that the esophagus has room to expand when you swallow food. That way, the trachea won't constrict the esophagus as it is going through peristalsis and squeezing down a mouthful of food to get to your stomach. So as that food bolus, which is what we call a mouthful of chewed up food, as that food bolus passes down the esophagus, there will be a slight bulge, kind of the same as when a snake swallows a large meal. And then that bulge then will have room to expand because the rings of cartilage are open on the back of the trachea, giving the esophagus the freedom of expansion that it needs. The trachea is about 12 centimeters long. So 12 centimeters, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the metric system, a centimeter is about, not quite, or just under about a half inch. So your 12 centimeters comes out to be a little, somewhere between 4.5 inches, give or take. So and again, this is going from the bottom of your larynx to where it will fork into your primary bronchi. So the actual singular tube, aka trachea or windpipe, is really not that long. People think it's a lot longer than it really is, but because it doesn't start until you are below the larynx or voice box, and then as soon as it forks, it's no longer the trachea. So it really is only about 5 inches long. The inferior portion of the larynx into the mediastinum, which is the space in between your lungs for your heart. There's an open area there called the mediastinum, where it divides into the right and left or primary bronchi. The tracheal cartilage rings are incomplete posteriorly facing the esophagus. The esophageal masses compress into the soft part of the trachea and make it difficult to breathe or even totally obstruct an airway. So if you ever have, I know, a classic food that I always, as a kid, would eat a lot of peanut butter. And sometimes when you swallow the food, that peanut butter will get stuck in your esophagus. So it made it past your larynx and did not go into and obstruct your airway, but that mouthful of food would get stuck in the esophagus, and it gives you that uncomfortable feeling of kind of hard to breathe, shortness of breath. And that is because that food bolus is pushing in on the back of the trachea, and it is not totally blocking, but it is slightly obstructing your airway. And that's why that feels so uncomfortable. So, when that does happen, just take a drink of something, and then usually that flushes it down and gets that food into your stomach. You can see here the ring of cartilage, and then this is where it's open, and here's your esophagus. So when a food bolus passes down the esophagus, it can actually push in and cause that to bulge in and slightly obstruct your airway. The right and left primary bronchi emerge from the inferior trachea and go to the lungs situated in the right and left pleural cavities. And we'll talk about those here, the pleural cavities, in just a second. But here's a breakdown. So all of this is the larynx. So the trachea goes from here to here. And once it forks the first time, then you have from here to here and from here to there is your primary bronchi. So you can tell the primary bronchi are not that long. They go from the first fork at the trachea until they branch off again. And then that next branch will then be called the secondary bronchi. The carina is an internal ridge located in the junction of the two mainstream bronchi, a very sensitive area for triggering the cough reflex. So that's right down there at the tip, just underneath the xiphoid process of your sternum. Sometimes they call that, the solar plexus, I think. And it is a very sensitive spot. And it is right there where it is the carina, right where the bronchi fork off of the trachea. The primary bronchi divide to form the secondary bronchi, and then they will branch to make the next branch. Then they become the tertiary bronchi, which respectively supply the lobes and segments of each lung. The tertiary bronchi divide into the bronchioles, which in turn branch through about 22 more division. And so at a certain point, you just quit counting them. You got your tertiary, and then, then you would have your quaternary, and so on and so forth. Well, after the tertiary branch, that third branch, then they just start to become so numerous that it's just too cumbersome to try to count them all. And typically, once they lose the rings of cartilage, then they're referred to as bronchioles. And again, anytime you see oles at the end of a word, it usually means little. So these are little bronchi, and as they branch, they get smaller and smaller. And if you can just visualize the tree, the trunk of the tree would be the trachea, and then that first fork in the trunk would be the primary bronchi. And after a certain point, there's so many branches that come off of the branches that it just numbering them becomes very tedious. So they just randomly refer to them as, that's a bronchiole. The smallest of the bronchioles are referred to as the terminal bronchioles. And just like the terminal of the airport, that's where the hallway ends, because that's the end of the airport. At that point, you are leaving the building that is the airport, and you are going into the airplane. So your walk terminates there at the end as you go into the airplane. So the terminal bronchioles would be the end of your tubular network of your airways, and then they're going to become the tiny air sacs in the lungs, which we will talk about here shortly. The bronchi and bronchioles go through structural changes as they branch and become smaller. The mucous membrane changes and then disappears at a certain point because the tubes are so small. We stop protecting the inside of them with that mucus layer, which is another reason why your lungs are so fragile. The other reason is at a certain point, we're going to need to exchange gases, and a layer of mucus on the surface of the tiny air sacs where gas exchange is going to take place will greatly inhibit how much oxygen you can get from the air and to diffuse into the blood. And if you research any breathing or respiratory disorders, having mucus in those air sacs is a bad thing. Makes it very difficult to keep your oxygen levels up. The cartilaginous rings become more sparse and eventually disappear altogether. At that point, the bronchial tubes become, as they get smaller and smaller, they don't need the rings of cartilage to support, to keep them open. As cartilage decreases, smooth muscle under the control of the autonomic nervous system increases. So that muscle there is to kind of help take the place of the structural support of the cartilaginous rings. All of the branches from the trachea to the terminal bronchioles are conducting airways, meaning that their job is just simply to get air in and get air out. At no point would any air that is in the trachea or any of the bronchial tubes will gas exchange take place. So that means as air goes into your body and as the atmosphere, and we'll talk about how that works, but as the atmosphere pushes air into your chest, any air that stops in the trachea or any air that stops in any of these blue tubes is not going to be involved in gas exchange and is going to keep its 21% oxygen levels inside of those molecules of air. This is how CPR works. You've ever wondered, how can I exhale, and have those levels of CO2 in my breath? How can I exhale into someone else's chest cavity and keep them alive? And that is because there's no way you can get all of the air into the tiny air sacs where gas exchange takes place. If that were to happen, then that means the inside, you would have to create a vacuum inside your trachea and your bronchial tubes. And here on Earth, it's impossible to do. You're not going to be able to create a vacuum because the atmosphere is going to be constantly pushing that air into your airway. And you just can't do it. So any air is known as, sometimes referred to as the anatomical or respiratory dead space. That air is not going to lose any oxygen. And so that's why as you breathe out, it will contain oxygen. That's how you can blow on a fire and rekindle embers, because your breath is going to have oxygen in it. And we all know that a fire needs oxygen to burn. The cupped shape outpouching, which participate in gas exchange, are called alveoli. These are the tiny air sacs at the terminal end of your bronchial tubes where gas exchange takes place. And to me, they kind of resemble a bunch of grapes. But this is where the magic happens. This is where air is going to stop in these air sacs here. And this is where oxygen is going to leave the air and diffuse into your blood. And as you can see in this diagram, at that point, those alveoli are covered in tiny microscopic blood vessels we call capillaries. And as the blood comes in these blue arteries, because they're blue because they're being pumped away from the heart, all arteries carry blood away. As they come in, this blood is oxygen poor and circled around in this network, this web of blood vessel, this capillary bed around the alveoli. When exposed to that air, it will pick up oxygen, and then your heart is going to pump it along these red veins and bring it back towards the heart so that the heart can pump that oxygen-rich blood to all parts of the body. And these alveoli down in here, these tiny air sacs, that's where gas exchange takes place. Again, not in the bronchial tubes, but in the alveoli. The lungs receive blood via two sets of arteries. The pulmonary arteries carry deoxygenated blood from the right side of the heart to the lungs for oxygenation. We're going to learn in the cardiovascular system, these are the only arteries that carry deoxygenated or oxygen poor blood. So the rule is all arteries carry blood away from the heart, but the pulmonary arteries are the only ones that'll carry oxygen poor blood. And they're going to come from the right side of the heart. The right atrium, the right ventricle is going to pump this oxygen poor blood to the lungs, where it will pick up oxygen in the capillary beds around the alveoli. And then it's going to come back through the pulmonary veins, and it's going to come back to the left side of the heart. Now it's oxygen rich, and the left side of the heart is going to pump it to all parts of the body. And we'll go into a lot more detail on that when we get to the cardiovascular system. The bronchial arteries branch from the aorta and deliver oxygenated blood to the lungs, primarily perfusing the muscular walls of the bronchi and the bronchioles. So there will be a set of arteries that will come off of the aorta, which is the largest artery in your body, carrying that life-giving oxygen-rich blood that will go feed the lungs. So there's a set of arteries that go to the lungs carrying oxygen-poor blood, and there's also a set of arteries that go to the lungs carrying oxygen-rich blood, because those lungs need oxygen-rich blood, just like all the other tissues in your body. As organs, the lungs are divided into lobes by fissures. The right lung is divided by the oblique fissure and the horizontal fissure into 3 lobes. The left lung is divided into 2 lobes by the oblique fissure. The reason the left lung is smaller is because 2/3 of the mass of your heart is left of center of your chest. So your heart is there, and there's more mass of heart on the left side of your chest than on the right. So, laws of physics, matter can't occupy 2 things at the same place at the same time. So since the heart is there, that side of that lung is a little smaller. Each lobe receives its own secondary bronchus that branches into the tertiary segmental bronchi, which continue to further divide. The apex of the lung is superior and extends slightly above the clavicles. That's, again, your collarbones, which I'm sure we all know now. The base of the lung rests on the diaphragm. And remember, the diaphragm is that muscle at the bottom of your thoracic cavity that controls your breathing. The cardiac notch in the left lung, the indentation for the heart, makes the left lung 10% smaller than the right. Again, because most of the heart, mass of the heart, is going to be left of the midline of your body. The lungs are separated from each other by the heart and other structures in the mediastinum. That's that space in the middle that separates the 2 lungs. Each lung is enclosed in a double-layered pleural membrane. The parietal pleura line the walls of the thoracic cavity, so they're going to line your chest cavity. The visceral pleura adhere tightly to the surface of the lungs themselves and will protect each individual lung. So you're going to have a layer of parietal pleura around the right lung, a layer of, visceral pleura, visceral meaning organ, the visceral pleura around the right lung. You'll have a layer of visceral pleura around the left lung, and then there'll be the open space in your chest cavity. And then you'll have the parietal pleura that's going to line the inside of your thoracic cavity. So it kind of creates a closed container, a sealed off chamber for you to breathe in. And you can think of your lungs as, with that visceral pleura, as 2 balloons inside that closed container. All right, that is going to be the end of this video lesson. All right, so that's going to do it for all of the material in the video lesson 2 on the respiratory system. If we're on remote, you will now go back to Schoology and take your exit slip. If you are home on quarantine, then this will help you keep up with what we are covering in class. So if you have any questions, as always, just shoot me an email. And again, because I'm a YouTuber, don't forget to click like and subscribe. Talk to you later.